Joining and thank you for tuning in to HCCA This Digger Dialogue. In these difficult times, HCCA is continually seeking ways to provide relevant information and value to our members on a variety of topics. A special thanks, as always, to Ashley Hudson, who is the organizer and director of any event that takes place at HCCA, in particular, a current flow of Zoom presentations for our membership. Last week, I drove to Florida and back, but as I was driving and observing the road conditions in several other states, I kept thinking how fortunate Virginia is to have a strong partnership between VDOT, the heavy highway contractors, and the suppliers who are represented on this call and in our membership. The high quality of the road system in Virginia is a strong testament to a partnership that works collectively for the betterment of the state. Today, Stephen Rich and Bart Thrasher will present a fairly comprehensive presentation and then take questions at the end. Please make sure your microphone is muted during your presentation to avoid any background noise. The PowerPoint deck that is being used today will be available to members on the HCCA website following the presentation. Before I begin, I'd like to let Ashley Hudson say thank you to our event sponsor, Traffic Safety, and get the meeting started.
Hi, everyone. Yes, we would like to thank our event sponsor, Traffic Safety Supplies. You can find them on 29 South in Gainesville with a lot of great stuff that you'll need for your job sites. So with that, I will turn it over to Commissioner Britch and Bart Thrasher for our presentation today.
Thank you, Ashley. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today, albeit virtually in essence. But I've got a slide deck, and I'm going to share part of the presentation with Bart Thrasher today to be able to give you the highlights of where the department is, where we're going, and frankly, how we've adapted to the pandemic over the last 8 months. So certainly one of the things that I'd ask everyone to do is that if we could mute your line so that we don't get the feedback that we've been having. With that, Ashley, if you could go to the next slide, I'd appreciate it. So what have we been doing with where's VDOT been and how are we addressing COVID within our workplace? And as you know, safety within the agency has and always will be the agency's top priority, not only protecting our workforce, but also the public as a whole. In earnest, we had VDOT implemented an initial and a very proactive planning process, and we were monitoring the situation since January of last year, and it started actually our planning for the potential implementation of a pandemic hitting the shores of the United States well back into January. So we were monitoring the effects of China back into December. Next slide. So I've got to say that the department has taken has been nimble at best since the onset of the pandemic. We were successful in transitioning nearly 4,000 of our office staff into a telework status within 2 weeks. From March 15th to the end of March, those employees transitioned their workspaces out of their offices into their home offices, and as well as being able to work with the field in adapting to the COVID responses and social distancing and face coverings. We worked throughout the last, well, I'd say during March all the way through April, May timeframe, being extremely nimble to the ever-changing guidance that was being issued by the CDC and the Department of Health. There were a number of occasions that we all might remember that the CDC issued a guideline at about 6 o'clock on a Friday evening that suggested or recommended face coverings, and that was an about face after almost 3 or 4 weeks of face coverings aren't recommended. And so trying to procure face coverings for our field staff of about 3,700 people on a Friday night became a challenge, but we were very, very successful in doing that. We've gone through this process and have developed and continue to implement the lessons learned. We're doing that in real time. As we continue to go through this, we still are learning lessons as to how to adapt to COVID, most predominantly within the field forces. Next slide. So a little bit of this is that we all learned, I think, a new term this year. It certainly is social distancing and what that means and what that looks like. We've been looking at how we are able to get to our places of work in the field with one person per vehicle. At one point in time, we backed off on that and now require face coverings to be used when we cannot social distance within the field or in the vehicle, but also within the vehicles themselves. We've enhanced our cleaning protocols. One of the unique things and anecdotal from the spring and going into the summer is that we usually have a high rate of incidence of flu with our field staff in late April, early May timeframe. And what we found was that just by reinforcing hand washing and not touching the face and some of the social distancing, that our call outs were significantly down associated with flu, sick illnesses. And so we have had a higher attendance rates rather than vacancies. We were able to adapt and start looking at split shifts and to be able to accommodate the 40-hour work week to reduce the number of people being on an area headquarters lot at any given time. And then, of course, our office staff has become very accustomed to virtual meetings such as this and online collaboration. Very early on, we implemented a travel ban that was not just for out-of-state travel. It included inter-district travel, and then isolated, we allowed travel only within the districts, but not crossing district boundaries unless absolutely required. Next slide. So probably one of the topics that I'll talk a little bit more about in the presentation, but I'm sure is of everyone's interest, is the funding impacts associated with COVID on the transportation system. At the start, and I've said this since March, we started, Virginia, as well as the department, started in an excellent and very strong cash position. If you recall, the Secretary of Finance very early on, right after the General Assembly session concluded in March, had mentioned and had stated that they were not going to start another forecast based upon the information that they had at the time, because it would be very bleak. And I think that was a very prudent measure taken at that time, not to reforecast and rebaseline the anticipated revenues, simply because what we've seen coming out of the end of the fiscal year is that in VDOT's case, we were only down about $121 million out of the revenues anticipated. So certainly we went into the pandemic very strong in the revenues. We were ahead of the revenue forecasts that were given at that time. And again, VDOT's cash position then and now is very strong. This does not, being in a strong position is a good thing going into it, but there will be impacts, and those really largely remain unknown at this point in time. We are working with the General Assembly in the special session back in April timeframe, or the veto session. We were able to get an amendment passed that allowed for a delay in the adoption of the 6-year plan. It gives the department the opportunity to really look at the anticipated revenue forecast over the next several months, to get a baseline figure as to what is a realistic revenue stream that can be anticipated. And so we have the ability to delay the adoption of a 6-year plan until July 1st of 2021. We are looking at, as things become a little bit more normalized, we are looking at the potential of an adoption of a plan earlier or sooner. We'll see within the first quarter of this fiscal year as to what our tax revenues are anticipated to be. So we do have flexibility right now in when we can adopt the 6-year plan. But by and large, we're moving forward with the plan as it is today. Next slide. So some of the items that we took immediate steps to, and this is true for any downturn in the economy that the state or the Commonwealth is going to have, is that we're going to eliminate our discretionary spending and implemented a hiring freeze. And certainly, as I've already said, that we've had a travel ban that we put into place as well. So this allows us to, one, we've eliminated meetings, obviously part of the discretionary spending increases, and then we're carrying a large vacancy rate at this point. We are still hiring for critical positions, field positions predominantly. Those are exempt from the hiring freeze. We are continuing to operate under the FY 2020 conditions. What this means is that we've flatlined our maintenance program to be operating under those projections that were in the FY 20 fiscal year. And then honestly, I think this is the most important part, is that while we're operating under those fiscal year 20 conditions, we do continue to advertise projects, let projects, and hire consultants. So what you see within the current 6-year plan are those schedules are continuing to be met. We put projects out every 2 weeks into the bid process, and we continue to let those projects out for construction and maintenance activities. We do anticipate that during this session that started Tuesday, we did submit a budget amendment for consideration to the General Assembly that will allow us the flexibility to use our strong cash position to meet our obligations that are in the 6-year plan without changing our schedules. And we're seeking that ability to use the various pots of money that are, as I call it, the buckets of money, as in totality to meet our obligations and not be constrained by only those buckets and being able to use those funding sources in that one way. So we're hopeful that the budget amendment does go through. We would certainly ask for your support or your membership support in getting that pushed through during the General Assembly. After this, after the session ends, and if we do get the flexibility or don't get the flexibility, then we'll have some additional guidance on the full range of projects and programs that are out there, which would be inclusive of smart scale. We recognize smart scale applications for round 4 have been just finalized and submitted this past week, this Tuesday, I believe. And then we still have revenue sharing and some other funding programs that we'll be providing guidance on. And this would be inclusive of giving additional guidance to localities on what they can anticipate for their city street maintenance payments. Next slide. So I want to take a couple minutes in the next couple slides and talk about the business plan that the department put into place back in April of 2018. And at that time, we really wanted to focus on 9 particular tenets, as I called them at that time, of focus that the department was going to undertake over the next 4 years. And this is just going to be a quick recap of the 4 major parts of that business plan, really focused on the delivery of the system, creating a pipeline of projects, focusing on maintenance and operations as well. So next slide, Ashley. The first slide, or the first part of that business plan really continued to focus on our execution of the program and making sure that we were on time and on budget. Next slide. We don't want to lose sight of our ability to be able to deliver those projects, or those projects that are in the 6-year plan. Certainly, this is one of those reasons why I believe that we've been successful in the 81 projects in getting additional funds for that corridor, as well as a number of other funding avenues that have taken place successfully within the legislature over the last 2.5 years. And it's our ability to be able to deliver projects on time and on budget. And so our credibility is certainly there. This slide is only, Bart's going to get a little bit more into our performance metrics in his portion of the presentation. But for right now, this slide is just to show how we're performing in the project development side, or on the engineering and right-of-way utility side of the house. You can see that the department continues to meet its obligations and its targets, in some cases being a little bit slightly above. This continues to be a source for the chief engineer to be laser focused on the delivery of those projects. The issue that you can see down below now becomes the non-VDOT managed projects, or those that are managed by the localities. On the project development side, they're doing fairly better. This is only the first year that we've produced their performance on the dashboard, but we continue to make sure that their performance mirrors that of ours. And you can see that the overall metrics, that we're on time, we are delivering all the projects basically on time, a little bit of a cushion there, but on budget, we still have some work to do. Next slide. Here's one that's a little bit more concerning, certainly on the contract delivery, or on the construction end of the delivery mechanisms. The department certainly continues to be able to provide those projects. These are typically larger in size, dollar value, as well as scope and complexity. So we're doing, our metrics on this side of the house are doing very well, and continue to be doing very well even in light of the pandemic. The one area that I am concerned about is certainly the locally administered projects. And as you can see, on-time performance is significantly less than the targets that are out there, but they are being able to manage their budgets. One of the items that I keep saying, both the industry and to the departmental staff, is that time is money. And certainly, if we can't deliver projects on time, as we're showing here, we're going to be chasing inflation. So this is one of the areas that we need to continue to focus on. And Bart will be having a quarterly performance review with the district engineers this afternoon, and this is going to be one of the topics that he will be discussing. But let's not lose sight of time is money in the delivery of this, as well as when we're not delivering those projects on time, the citizens of the Commonwealth are not getting the resources that they need as expected. So this continues to be a source of focus for the chief engineer. Next slide. The other focus area that I've been keen on is making sure that we're maintaining the infrastructure in the most appropriate manner. The key here is that we need to maintain what we have before we continue to implement new capacity improvements or new infrastructure items that are going to continue to reduce the amount of funds that are available to maintain the infrastructure that we currently have in place. Next slide. One of these focus areas in making sure that we have a sustainable program for our maintenance and operations has been a study that the General Assembly requested us to undertake, which was at the time the Robert O. Norris Bridge and Special Structures Fund legislation. The good news is that the department had started this study in earnest in 2018 to really look at how do we create a sustainable level of investment into our infrastructure for maintenance, in particular operations. And by and large, what we're calling it, it was a significant comprehensive review of our maintenance program. It looked at our current conditions and performance targets of our pavements and bridges and our routine maintenance. It investigated the investment strategies in our highway maintenance and operations fund, as well as the state of good repair program. And at least for the pavement program, we looked at how do we create sustainability in the performance over a 20-year period, rather than looking at something in 2 or 6 year funding cycles. We recognize that in the pavements, those pavements are going to last in excess of 10 to 15 years, in some cases longer than that. And it's inappropriate that we only look in windows of 2 years. So this gives us the performance metric over of at least 2 life cycles of pavement, at least on the interstate system. For our bridge program, certainly we looked at a 50-year useful life of those structures. And we do have some changes that I'll talk to you a little bit about on what we've done there in that bridge program. But part of this comprehensive review is also to look at creating performance metrics for our ordinary performance or ordinary maintenance items, our ditching, our daylighting of roadways and signage, and making sure that we're being proactive in many of those cases than being reactive. We know that water is the #1 damager or source of damage to our pavements. So if we aren't doing the preventative maintenance activities and getting water away from our pavements, then having a $450 million to $500 million a year investment in our paving program is not appropriate. We need to get back to the basics, as I call it, and get back to getting ourselves back into a routine of preventative maintenance and ditching activities. I'd say that the #1, in addition to setting performance targets for pavements and our bridges, the #2 outcome of the comprehensive review, in my mind, that has been most successful in the first time in the department's history, is that we've developed an investment strategy to address our critical and special structures that we have there, our tunnels, our movable bridges, and our complex structures that had not had a reserve fund, and it's my term, a reserve fund that has been attached specifically to address the long-term maintenance needs of those assets. When I look at the Glens Island Bridge tractor gears for this, it looks like it's running off of a 1930 tractor engine to be able to move that. Its maintenance history and its reliability have gotten to the point where it's causing more problems, and we need to invest back into proactively updating those assets to be able to meet the needs of the Commonwealth and its citizens in a similar manner as to what the private sector would be doing with their own investment strategies. Next slide. So I've already touched quite a bit on this slide, and this is much more dealing with what we've changed with the bridge program. We looked at it again; it's long-term sustainability, and we're migrating to a preservation-first approach. What we've been able to do, our previous process was looking at those that were structurally deficient and funding those assets to be able to remove the number of structurally deficient bridges that we had. But no longer are we focused on that. We will still focus on structurally deficient, but we aren't going to be looking at worst first. What we found is that worst first has a higher cost than a proactive preservation. And we're able to look to preserve the assets that we have, close to our 21,000 structures statewide, within the existing funding level that we have. We've only touched 10% of our structures over the last 10 years. And that's a significant impact when you recognize that 90% of those assets continue to degrade on an annual basis. So part of this preservation first approach is again making sure that those structures are safe. We'll continue to monitor them, and we will readjust our program to accommodate ones that are degrading at a faster rate to make sure that the safety of the system is continuously being met. Next slide. So you can see this is just a picture of the interstate system. You may have seen this within some of the presentations to the Commonwealth Transportation Board throughout the 2019 or calendar year 2019. What you see is where we've been focused, at least on the interstate system. The top line is the number of structurally deficient bridges. The bottom set of lines are the average condition ratings that you have. We recognized as we started doing this comprehensive review is looking at the investment strategies that we're making, what's going to happen to our assets over the 50-year period. You can see if we were looking in a 2 to 5 or maybe a 2 to 6 year window, we're doing pretty good, but our level of investment, if we did not change our strategy, could have gotten us into a position where we would be continuing to focus on structurally deficient bridges. And you can see that dotted orange line, that if we focused on structurally deficient, was going to drop down to below the 90% mark. And that's simply because the number of assets that were built all within the same time period, their end of useful life hits right around that 20 to 25 year mark. So looking forward. So under a preservation approach, we continue to look at all of the assets, not just a small percentage, and we're able to accommodate a very small percentage of decrease in our structurally deficient, but we continue to look at our average condition rating and making sure it's appropriate and maintain at an acceptable level of service. Next slide. Similar process that we undertook for pavement conditions across the board. This year, I'm sure most of your membership recognize that we've changed the performance targets for secondary facilities as well as primary roadways, and focused on creating a differential between high volume and low volume facilities. And this was really meant to address the needs of the citizens of the Commonwealth. No person should be driving on a facility that has the same volume of traffic and having two different metrics, recognizing that it's still serving the same purpose. Just because a primary is labeled as a primary and a secondary is labeled as a secondary should be not a differentiator for the performance targets that are there. Next slide. This has been a key focus area of the business plan as well. We all know that we need to create a sustainable pipeline of projects, not have years that go like gangbusters in the next several years. Our industry drops off. So we wanted to level that out and really create a long-term sustainable pipeline of projects, both in the design phase, but also in the construction phase. Next slide. So some of the things that we have done to be able to accommodate this, and I think this has been a huge win, especially in light of COVID this year as well, is that House Bill 1414 during the 2020 legislative session was passed. And by and large, it really restructures the Virginia's transportation funding model that we have in place. By and large, it creates the Commonwealth Transportation Fund rather than, I'll say, various buckets of monies that existed prior to the Omnibus bill. This is certainly going to allow us to be able to meet our obligations in totality and use those funds very flexible. The second thing, it does transform rail in Virginia, and it creates the rail authority. And then finally, it improves safety along Virginia's highways by creating a safety fund that is in addition to the Highway Safety Improvement Program, and looks to leverage monies between the Department of Motor Vehicles and VDOT in accomplishing certain safety targets that we have already implemented. One thing, the last bullet on the slide I'll call your attention to is that part of the Omnibus bill does allow us to move funds that were in the Route 58 Corridor Bond Improvement Program to complete the remaining, I believe it's 1.6 or 1.7 miles of Corridor Q to Grundy. So we're going to be looking to advance that project in the coming 6 months to 8 months, and see if we can't get that project moving forward, and recognize that at that point in time we would deliver the entire Coalfields Expressway at that point. Next slide. So part of what the Omnibus bill does is certainly raises the gas tax by 5 cents per year for the first 2 years. And then after that, it will increase according with CPI instead of the sales price of fuel. So we should see a continual increase in this. And this is something that I think we all in industry have waited to see, and this year was the year to be able to do it. As I said, this has been a monumental piece of legislation to begin with, and I think this was very successful without COVID. But with COVID, it certainly only helps offset the negative effects that are going to be felt with the loss of revenue back from COVID. I will point out, and Ken and I were having a quick conversation before the webinar started, was that it's important to note that gas tax revenue is one of the three-legged stools predominantly that come into the Commonwealth Transportation Fund at this point. We still have motor vehicle sales that is important, as well as sales tax as a whole, that are the other two legs of that. So while this does backfill a portion of the loss of revenues, it still does not offset the full loss of revenue that will be affected or be felt by in those other two buckets of revenue streams. Next slide. So a little bit more about the legislation and the additional investments. Again, the special structures will be funded. This is the first time that it will have a reserve fund attached to that, and we already have a plan, a 25-year to 50-year plan of investment for those assets. When it's fully funded, albeit there's some delays because of COVID in funding that, but when it becomes fully funded, we're looking at close to $100 million being invested back into those vital assets that are moving significant volumes of traffic, especially within our tunnel facilities and movable bridges. We continue to reinvest in our pavement maintenance program. I believe we're going to get 38 additional million coming into the pavement program when this is fully funded. Again, COVID is impacting our overall program as it is right now. Smart scale and safety, we touched on a little bit, rail transit, and then looking at port aviation and the spaceport as well. This last bullet I think is very important, is that we continue to look at our transportation revenues as a whole. Frankly, I look at them on a daily basis with the chief financial officer, making sure that our cash position remains strong and our cash flow is meeting the needs. The good news is, I said at the beginning of this, we're able to meet our current existing commitments that we have made, and those that are contained in the 6-year plan, with the schedules that are shown in the plan without any changes. And that's going to need the flexible legislation that we're seeking within the General Assembly at this point. As we go forward, there is uncertainty from the Department of Tax and what the revenue streams do look like. So we're very cautious, but we're very optimistic. We continue to look at what the impact of our traffic is as a precursor to potentially the gas tax revenue. And if you saw to the Commonwealth Transportation Board at our May or June meeting, our traffic engineering division presented what the traffic volumes are doing on our facilities, predominantly on our interstate facilities. And the low point really became right around April 15th. And as of this morning, and speaking with the district administrators, we're within 5 to 10% of pre-COVID traffic volumes. So certainly as a precursor, people are getting out there, are driving, but as we finish out the summer season, we are starting to see a slight reduction in our volumes. So again, this is something that we look at on a daily basis, and we'll be monitoring very closely for the first 2 quarters of this fiscal year. Next slide. I think another important part of this past legislative session was the creation of the Central Virginia Transportation Authority. This is certainly, I won't read the slide, but certainly has a variety of sales tax and use tax mechanisms to be able to generate additional revenues for the Central Virginia region as a whole. We knew that back in March, our projected early part of March pre-COVID revenue estimates were looking at an investment of close to $200 million coming back into the Central Virginia region in addition to other funding mechanisms. So this is going to mirror Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads as being another transportation authority. This CVTA will have its inaugural meeting next Thursday, August 27th. So they will be getting up and underway, and we're excited to have a list of projects and working with the region to advance projects using these funds. Next slide. So one of the other areas of VDOT's business plan that has been a significant driver in our focus over the last 2.5 years has been making sure that we create a system that is efficient with our operations. As I've told the current chief engineer and the previous chief engineer, we can have the best bridges in the country and the smoothest pavements in the world, but if we are not moving people and goods efficiently, it is of no value to us. So a focus of the agency has been and will continue to be our efficient operations of the system and utilizing all the capacity that we can garner out of it. Next slide. So some of the wins that I want to point out to you that we've been really focused on in enhancing operations of the system is our focus on the interstate corridor improvement program. As you know, the first focus was on the 81 corridor, and then we focused our attention last year on looking at the improvements from on 95 all the way from North Carolina and Washington, D.C. And now we have a similar study up and underway along the 64 corridor, all the way from Covington down to the Hampton Roads region. Most of those studies have identified our focus continues to be the focus on investing on our safety service patrols and being able to clear incidents fast, use of changeable message signs along the corridors to make sure that motorists have the most up-to-date information to make timely decisions, cameras to be able to detect our incidents faster to allow us to clear those incidents at a faster rate. And we're looking at a number of opportunities that exist to use variable speed limits to affect driver behavior along these corridors. We are looking at in addition to advancing projects, capital improvements along the corridor, you've seen, and I'll touch a little bit on 81, and I know Bart is going to touch on his area of passion, which is also on the 81 corridor. Next slide. So just a quick update, the 81 corridor, we finished that plan. We are in the process of implementing that plan from the operations end. As soon as that legislation took place along the 81 corridor, on July 1st, at 12:01 midnight, we implemented additional safety service patrols along the corridor, and within the first quarter of that improvement, we saw about 20% reductions in incident duration. So I think that's been a win. Right now, we're focused on a number of improvement projects, capital improvement projects that have been awarded and that are starting the construction phase, and we also continue to have a number of design build projects along the way, and I'll let Bart touch on that. 95, we're in the feedback plan. That plan is nearly complete with a list of projects there as well, and our first comment period for the 64 corridor completed back on August 14th. So big wins for those corridors, and more to come on that. Next slide. So I just want to reiterate before I hand this over here to Bart in the next few slides, is that we certainly went into or have been working on in a very focused manner a plan for our success and delivery of a number of projects and programs. And I think we've been very successful over the last 2.5 years in, frankly, the 81 corridor, if we did nothing else, was a big win. But we also have HRBT under design, and procurement has already been completed. For those that don't know, we were successful in getting the joint permit application last week, and we're heading down to a notice to proceed this month. So $3.8 billion design build project moving forward. Central Virginia Transportation Authority up and underway, and again, this is certainly everything that we have asked for. We have more or less gotten. So next slide. So if someone asked me today what keeps me awake, other than tunnels and ferries and COVID right now, it really comes down to the delivery of the program. I remain concerned that as we continue to move forward with the program, that we have gotten everything that we asked for. So it really is going to be incumbent upon our consultant industry and our contracting industry to deliver what we said that we could do using the funds that we said we needed. So this, we can have a conversation at the end of Bart's presentation, but what it really boils down to at this point in time is our ability to deliver and make good on what we said we could do. Next slide. So at this point, I'm going to turn the conversation over to Bart and let him continue on with it.
Bart, if you could please turn your volume down, because I think we're getting feedback from your computer.
How's that? Any better?
That seems better. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so when you're coming in behind the big man, you always want to preface everything you say. So if I happen to say anything today that contradicts anything that the individual who spoke before me did, then I misspoke, or obviously you misunderstood me. So I want to make sure I get that out there. You never contradict the boss. Next slide, please, on the work zone safety. So safety and the welfare of our folks is the most important responsibility we have. That's why I have it as the first slide. We have an obligation to not only our VDOT staff, but to your all staff to make sure everybody gets home every night safe and sound. and safety is and will remain and will continue to remain our highest priority. 2020 is a reminder to be familiar with the new revisions to our work area protection manual. We have new requirements on temporary rumble strips and flagging operations. That was something we went over with our district administrators again this morning. And the top three findings in CQIP work zone have been that we have flaggers not performing their duties as required. And that can be anything from not paying attention to what's going on around them. I've actually seen flaggers sitting on guardrail or leaning up against guardrail, taking an afternoon siesta. I've seen folks that didn't have on the proper PPEs. You name it, we've seen it. And that's both our folks and our partners' folks. Improper setup and worn, damaged work zone signage. It doesn't have reflectivity on it. You can't see it, especially at night. You're coming through a rainstorm, which we have a lot of here in the last couple of weeks. And then TMA signage and certifications. Next slide, please, Ashley. So I started off with work zone safety, and the next item I'm going to hear me talk about is environmental stewardship. And VDOT takes the environmental stewardship of all our products with the highest priority. I want to make sure everybody understands that. Our environmental performance statewide is improving, but we need to continue to be proactive instead of reactive when it comes to environmental compliance. I want to make sure that both VDOT and our teammates have a clear understanding of the environmental requirements, and they are included when you all make bids to maintain this compliance. We expect the industry to place the same amount of importance with their staff as VDOT does with their own. Currently, we have 86 active projects with a construction general permit and our environmental components or commitments. For the most part, we have 81 that are green projects. We have 3 yellows and we have 2 oranges, and we have 1 red. I encourage the industry to take into account the environmental requirements that will be needed on any project. Just reemphasize that this is not the area where you want to try and save money on your project. It's better to address it now and be prepared than to ignore and hope that everything will be fine and go away. As I often tell our folks in the field and here in central office, remember that hope is not a plan. Next slide, please. Just a little bit about our EPP program, which is environmental performance. EPP has led to improvements in environmental performance and has identified areas where collaborative solutions are being developed between the department and our industry partners. It provides regular feedback on project efficiencies. It allows us to have corrective actions to take place. And most of all, it helps to avoid potential regulatory enforcement actions, which is something we don't want to see on a job site. We want to make sure that we take care of this between us and the contractor and with you all, and then we're working together as a team to address these situations. Experience shows us that when we work together, we have better results. And one more item that's actually not on this slide, but I've been preaching about pretty regularly, and we actually talked about it on this morning's call with our districts, is thus far we've been making some good progress and prepping our construction sites when we have these storms come through. We've been having a lot of those come through in the last few weeks. That when you go out and prep and you do what you have to do, it's not going to cover you for an act of God if we get a 100-year storm. But when you go out and do what we have to do, for the most part, we have less reportable incidents. You know, accidents are going to happen, and at some point, we've all seen it, and you're going to have something blow on a project. But the impacts have been less severe when we've been proactive in addressing these, and it's easier to correct. And more importantly, it shows that we have a united partnership to the regulatory agencies between VDOT and our industry teammates. So next slide, please, Ashley. This is just some notable projects that we've let out here recently. You guys have probably already seen these. This is just an overview. We have the northbound Rappahannock River crossing, which is up in Fredericksburg. Route 277 project in Stanton, which is widening to 5 lanes. We have the Rappahannock River Route 3 Chatham Bridge, which we just put out here recently. That's in Fredericksburg. 29 northbound and southbound bridges over the Norfolk Southern Railroad, which is actually in Lynchburg. And then the last one deals with the last project we put out on I-81, which is exit 141 to 143 in the Salem district. Next slide, please, Ashley. So this is just a program outline of FY 2021, which is actually July of 2020 through June of 21. And these are products in the pipeline that are to be advertised for the fiscal year of FY 2021 as of the end of July, this July. This includes VDOT managed projects only. And it includes projects targeted to be advertised in FY 21, but are not yet advertised. So you can see that across the board, we got about 206 projects coming out at a construction value of about $1.1 billion, which is pretty good. That's a pretty good program for us. Next slide, please. The commissioner talked a few slides back about performance metrics and how we are doing on those. Some areas we're doing good in, some areas we're not. And anybody who's worked with me over the years knows I'm very competitive, and I don't like to be second best at anything we do. So we will continue to refine that and push forward. These are just numbers for our construction delivery for VDOT. This is not locally administered project put into it. It's just VDOT numbers, and you can see our VDOT numbers are pretty good. But we need to have this across the board in both VDOT and locally administered projects. Next slide, please. Something of probably interest to your CEI folks on the call. Since 2016 to 2019, we've had a downfall in how much CEI contracts we put out. And so I've kind of broken this up between the districts and central office. So for 2020, our projection is we'll be about 7% higher than the numbers we put out in 2019. And based upon the work we have in the pipeline now, I believe that those numbers will continue to increase in 2021. Next slide, please. Another item of interest, this is claims. Currently, we have 13 claims that are pending that have been submitted in 2019 to 2020. We have a two-step process on this. We have 4 claims that were resolved at the state construction engineers level, so that's Carrie's level. We have 1 claim pending with the state construction engineer out of the 13, so that's a total of 5. 3 claims are pending with the deputy commissioner. That's our step 2 in our administrative claims process. The first one goes to the state construction engineer, it's Carrie Bates. The second one would go to Rob Carey, who was our deputy commissioner. And then we have 5 claims that are currently in litigation. Next slide, please, Amy. However, if you look at it in a larger picture, claims are going to happen. We all know that. That's just part of the nature of the business. But we have been able, for the most part, to come to some type of resolution in the field with less than 3% of our projects resulting in a claim. Now, when I look at other state DOTs across the nation, when I tell other chief engineers that we have about a 3% claims process, they ask me to go back and check my math to make sure that's correct. And what I think that is, it shows the ability for VDOT and industry to work together. We're not always going to come to an agreement, and that's okay. I can assure you that we will be fair in our dealings with you all on this. But you all have to understand that we are the stewards of taxpayers' money, and that's how we have to look at it. But to have approximately 16 million claims based on our total construction number, that's less than 1% of our total work in progress, which I think is phenomenal. And I want to make sure we keep it that way. Next slide, please. This is the slide that we show just about every year. It shows our contract advertisements in millions. We're about halfway through. The agency remains on target. These numbers have not changed since about February for the most part. The program remains strong and moving forward. The commissioner talked earlier that we are not letting off on the gas pedal, and I don't anticipate that to happen. Of course, everything depends upon the revenue funding that comes in, but we're in a good situation right now. Most advertisements of projects this time of the year since 2016, and that's good. So at this time of the year, we haven't had this number of projects going out since 2016. We currently have some of the largest construction projects in the history of VDOT out right now. The I-66 outside the Beltway in Northern Virginia, which is about a little over $2 to $3 billion. HRBT, the commissioner talked about that a few minutes ago. That's just starting to get started in Hampton Roads. The high-rise bridge in Hampton Roads, another $500 million project. FredEx in Fredericksburg, and then the big boy out in Southwest Virginia, which is I-81. Next slide, please. Here's just a slide of what we think are being upcoming potential design build projects. We know that the Richmond City bridges on I-95 in Richmond District, that's estimated construction value or contract value of somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 million. And we anticipate an RFQ release in the fall of 2020. Boundary Channel Road interchange in Northern Virginia, got a contract value on that of about $15 million. We anticipate RFQ on that one coming out in the fall of 2020 as well. Hampton Road Express Lanes, which I'll talk about in a couple different slides in a little more detail. Looks like we're looking at the first RFQ for that in April of 2021. And then I-81, we'll have mile marker 48.1 to 48.9, which is northbound XL improvements in Bristol. That'll be coming out very shortly as well. Next slide, please. So this is just an overview of the Hampton Roads Express Lanes projects. And you can see that we have different segments there. You can actually see Jefferson to LaSalle at 12 o'clock working their way around. You have LaSalle to Settlers. What's in the green color is actually the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel. Coming out of there, we have 564 to 264. And the last segment is the high-rise bridge with Bowers Hill, 264 to Bowers Hill. Next slide, please. So segment one, and this is the slide for that, which gives you a brief description of that, what kind of work we anticipate having there. Converting 9 miles of existing general purpose shoulders into hot part-time shoulder lanes in each direction. And we anticipate an RFQ coming out in September of 21 with the RFP in January of 22. And plan to award that in July with the construction completion date of December 2025. Next slide, please. This is segment 4A4B, which is this is 10.5 miles of existing HOV in hot lanes. Again, this is an advertisement in May of 23 with an award of July. We anticipate the construction dollars on this one to be about $128 million. So another good sized project coming into Hampton Roads, with the major item on this being the bridge replacement over LaSalle. Next slide, please, Ashley. Segment 4C, this will be a design build. The project before that, which we anticipate being a design bid build, but this one will be design build. So out of those 3 projects, we're looking at 2 design build and 1 design bid build. RFQ coming out in 21, RFP coming out in November of 21. All 3 of these projects we're looking at having a construction completion date of December of 25. This construction amount on this is about $440 million. Because you've got these 2 bridge replacements over the Hampton River. They're the two big things on here, plus the widening and the rehabs. Next slide, please. So a little more detail on the I-81 corridor. This is a slide that we showed at the I-81 Advisory Committee update in October. We have 1 project that we still have in the PE environmental evaluation phase. 31 projects that are in design, and we have 8 projects that are currently in construction. Next slide, please. Again, this is just an overview of the 81 program. We are taking a phased project-specific design contracts on this at this point. We've awarded 5 contracts to 5 different firms over the past year. We have an update on that. We actually awarded the 6th contract last week. Out of those, we've had design bid build projects in Bristol for the southbound I-77 decel lanes, as well as some XL extensions out around mile marker 8. Design build projects, we have one in Salem right now, we've bundled one, which is from 136 to 141. And we got a targeted RFP of September, October of this year. We have the potential for another design build projects coming out in Bristol, which will be around the Marion exit of 48.1 to 48.9, which will be a bundling of XL and decel lanes. The driving factor in determining whether or not we operate with a design build is we want to make sure we have a good, healthy program on the corridor. So we want to have both design build and design bid build projects. And this helps us to ensure a successful and time delivery. We also sat down last year with industry and went through the entire corridor, sat down to listen to what types of projects that industry would think would be the most efficient for us. And we've talked about bundling projects and going design build. We have done that thus far. So this just shows another example of VDOT and the industry getting together to work together for a common cause. Whenever we can make the situation easier for the industry and it's advantageous for VDOT, that's something we definitely want to do. Next slide, please. These are just operational improvements along the corridor. I'm just going to give you some breakdown on the traffic cameras. We've placed 25 additional cameras in Bristol District over the last year. We've got another 4 additional cameras that are coming up in Salem, with 5 more that will be available by the TOC. And in Stanton, we put in an additional 12 cameras. So that just lets you know that we knew we had issues on 81 with being able to see when incidents were happening. Not only does it help us to cover incidents from an accident standpoint, but it also helps us to be more efficient during the wintertime with our snow removals. Our safety service patrol enhancements have been complete. We are doing a towing and recovery incentive program, which is underway and scheduled for completion in December. And our lift and tow program is already up and running now. Changeable message boards, they're under construction. They're actually ahead of schedule. We expect those to be done in October of 21. Next slide, please, Ashley. So this is just a scorecard of where we happen to be on 81. Things that don't get measured don't get done. So the curve improvements, we've got the status of those that they were completed in fall of 2019. XL and decel lane extensions are underway. Again, we expect those to be finished in the fall of 2020. 51 additional cameras, we expect those we're done. We need to update that on the slide. Additional change message boards, they're underway with a finish date of October 21. Arterial upgrades, they continue to be done, and we'll be working on those through 2022. We have 32 remaining capital projects and that we will be done under this first initiative, and those dates vary. I want to also let you know that the ID1 website went active on July 24th of this year, and it's a very informative website. I use it quite a bit. I would encourage you to let your folks know that. It gives you the projects that are out there now. It gives you timelines on future projects, and a lot of beneficial information coming from the localities. And with that, that concludes my presentation. So I guess we were open for questions.
Bart and Steve, thank you. That was so. There's 2 ways to ask a question. You can ask it verbally, or you can put it in the chat box. What questions do we have for these 2 gentlemen?
Like right here, but what it amounts to, I say go to the bridge and come on. We have like
Don't be shy. I can't believe they were that perfect in their.
You go out as a form of RFQ or?
I've now unmuted everyone. If anybody would like to ask a question, you are welcome to do that at this time.
It's Jason Stanford. Hello?
Yes, Jason, we can hear you.
Oh, actually, I just want to say great presentation. I think that you touched a little bit on the General Assembly amendments, which we've been following this year, and I think are actually very well crafted to sort of look into the future and see, make sure that we prioritize kind of what we have now, and that we're not sort of mortgaging our future. But I did want to check you and just see, do we know, there's nothing in the amendments that say it specifically, but is there any, I know that the General Assembly passed $20 million for NBTA this year. Is that a part of the new phased-in money, or is it the intent that that money would still continue to go to the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority?
Jason, the way that the amendment had been crafted is just giving us the authority to be able to continue to manage the monies that were allocated to the Department of Rail and Public Transportation and the other modal agencies. The monies that were dedicated to NVTA, HR TAC, and CVTA continue to be made as part of the pre-existing commitments.
Thank you.
Is there another question for Steve Rabar?
I have some additional questions, Ken, if no one else has any.
Go ahead, Jason.
I was curious at the recent Joint Commission on Transportation Accountability, Deputy Secretary Donahue had mentioned a greenhouse gas pilot and how that would be integrated into the environmental review process for projects. And I know in the second presentation, you talked a little bit about that. I was wondering if you had any details on what that would look like.
Jason, to be able to answer that, this has been an ongoing conversation with the administration and the department, and what we have put together has been an analysis of other states' practices with regard to incorporating greenhouse gas emissions into the environmental and planning process. Most notably is the purpose of the pilot is really to identify when we should be looking at a qualitative assessment versus a quantitative assessment, and then what types of projects are most beneficial from incorporating GHG analyses into the planning process. When you look across the country as to the impacts of GHG and the decisions that may be made on projects and alternatives to projects, they're wide ranging. And so what we want to do is be in a position to, one, understand the effects of GHG, two, understand what decisions would be made with the analysis results to be able to make sure that we're using the limited budgets that are available to us in the most appropriate manner and are going to make meaningful decisions. I can give you an example of what we're trying to work through at this point in time is what is an appropriate project for GHG in a quantitative or qualitative. Is a turn lane project appropriate for a GHG analysis? And I'd venture to say no. And that's not the intent of a GHG analysis. In that case, a turn lane project it is not going to afford other alternatives or modal alternatives. But when I look at the capital or the corridor improvement programs, such as 95, for example, and we look at the investments that do we widen 95 or do we make the investment into Long Bridge and rail from DC to points further south. Those are much more appropriate GHG analyses. So the first step in this pilot is going to be looking to create a baseline statistic looking at our current modal, our infrastructure that we have today, and then looking at our 6-year plan and looking at a full build out of that and what that's going to mean to greenhouse gas emissions. So this is not going to be an overnight item. I view that the work of the GHG will be presented to the Commonwealth Transportation Board's environmental task group once we start meeting again, but we're at the very early stage of conducting this pilot. So hopefully that was informative for you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
We do have a question in the chat box that I'll read to you guys. The governor's revised revenue forecast includes bad news for Virginia's transportation program, which fell short in revenues by $121 million in the last fiscal year and expects a shortfall of $750 million in the next 2 years because of big drops in fuel and sales tax collections. What will we know when will we know how this will affect us?
So to be able to answer that, I think I touched on the fact that the 121 million in reduction for fiscal year 20 was significantly less than what was being proposed for the final quarter. When we were entering March, those numbers related to COVID were looking at probably about a $700 million drop, or I'm sorry, a $400 million drop, and then 700 million this year. But according to Department of Tax, Ed's right that we're looking at about 375 million for the next 2 years. But in our conversations with the Department of Tax, this next first quarter of fiscal year 21 is going to be pivotal to us to better understand how the revenues will fall out. I talked a little bit about the three-legged stools: gas, motor vehicle sales, and registration and sales tax. What we saw is that we really need to have another quarter in our fiscal year revenue streams without delays in personal income tax, sales tax, and gas receipts coming in. So we'll have a better understanding of the projections going into November when Department of Tax does its official forecast. Right now, I think this is too soon to say that the $750 million reduction over the next 2 years we feel is high, but barring any other additional quantitative numbers, we are bound to use the Department of Tax's numbers. It's important to note that the Department of Tax numbers only go out 2 years rather than over the next 5 to 6 year projections. And so there's a great deal of uncertainty out there in how long this recovery will be. So I encourage that one of the reasons why we continue to have the request for the flexibility in the budget amendment is to meet our current obligations and using the cash position that we have to be able to meet those without any changes to schedules or projects at this point. But I envision by November, December time period, we'll have a much better feel for what we're going to do with regard to updating the 6-year plan and the longer term impacts that would be felt in years 5 and 6 of the program, and less so in the first 4 years.
Does that give you an answer, Ed?
Yes.
It sounds like, Steve, we may have to have you back somewhere in the late fall, January, to fill us in where the gaps are starting to fall.
I would be more than welcome to come back. This topic has been a source of discussion with the Secretary's office and the department almost on a weekly, if not bi-weekly basis, on running several permutations, better knowing what we know. As I said, coming out of this session, if we get flexibility, that will be one deciding factor that will help us navigate the waters for the next several years. And then two, once we get that rebaselined official forecast from the Department of Tax, we'll be in a much better position to give clarity on the program. So I would say in the December timeframe, once we have those numbers, I'd be more than happy to come back.
Excellent. Thank you. Do we have any other questions for Steve or Bart?
Hey, Ken, it's Jason again. Sorry, I had one other question if nobody had one. Just seeing real quick, do we know, or does VDOT have a place where we can kind of see, I hear a lot of people talk about how traffic numbers have changed as a result of the pandemic. Does VDOT have a place that we can actually go to kind of see those change in real time or reported, every week or month or something to that effect?
I'll answer that. Jason, is the short answer is no. I would steer you back to the presentation that was made to the Commonwealth Transportation Board in May or June by Mina Lockwood that showed the updates and changes to those traffic volumes. We intend to, at the September board meeting, give an update to that presentation to reflect what has occurred over the summer months. That will just be an update. I envision that update probably to be made on a quarterly basis, and if we need to, we'll make that update more frequent. But at least at this point, I anticipate having that in front of the Commonwealth Transportation Board on a quarterly basis.
Excellent. Thank you. Do we have any others? Well, in respect of everybody's time, I'd like to thank Steve and Bart for a wonderful presentation. Thank you all for dialing in. Ashley will put the slides up on our website before the end of business today, if you need to come back and look at these, and hope everybody has a good day. Thank you much for attending.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.
Steve.